Confession. For me as a Bible reader, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are not my favorite books to read. Why? I don't know why. They just seem to have a narrative style and a type of action that appears to happen after the main action, of the Torah and of the kingship and David and Saul and the kings and Samuel and all that stuff. The prophets are so exciting. But how exciting are Ezra and Nehemiah? Well, I will tell you this. I've sort of had a little bit of a rediscovery and a deep dive personally and intellectually into some materials from outside the Bible that have actually re-energized me for thinking about Ezra and Nehemiah. And I think for readers of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, this evidence I will talk about is actually the most important evidence you could look at outside of the Bible. Not so much for the content of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah or their theology, but really maybe actually for their theology and their contents in terms of thinking about the world of post-exilic Judaism and what it would mean for a Jewish group to return to the land and to rebuild the temple, and what it really meant for Jews to survive in a new time, in a new era. This evidence comes from a very unlikely place called Elephantine, and it is in Egypt. I have a little map here. Where is this map? Oh, here's the map. It's on the floor. It's my technical YouTube imagery here. You can see Elephantine down here on the river in southern Egypt. On this island, apparently a group of Jews lived, and they did some extraordinary things, and they lived there during the 400s BCE, which is the same time frame as the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. The action in Ezra and Nehemiah, difficult to put really specific dates on it. There's a lot of literature and debate on that issue, but let's just say that Ezra and Nehemiah are partly overlapping characters, and the main action narrated, at least in the present tense of those books, occurs during, the 450s, the 440s BCE. Middle of the 5th century, this is the time of the Persian Empire. They overthrow the Babylonians in the year 539, thereabouts, BCE. They become the empire that is the ruling empire in the ancient Near Eastern world. And they really had some extraordinary policies, it seems, toward peoples that the Babylonians had destroyed and captured and taken captive at exile. They really had a programmatic way of sending them back home, and even maybe asking them or endorsing them to rebuild local temples and reestablish local forms of worship, and also organize and establish local forms of taxation, very important to a big empire, of course. And for the empire, in the minds of the Persians, those things may be related, right? A community that has a clear religion and a clear temple, temples being sites not only of worship, but also sites of economic organization, would be pretty important to an empire, to the Persians. But let's back up on these people from Elephantine, this community I've called a Jewish community that lived there in the diaspora, spread out after exile in the 400s, in the 5th century BCE at Elephantine. How did they get there, and who were they, and what did they do that's so interesting for thinking about Ezra and Nehemiah? Well, one daring scholarly theory by a really great scholar named Karl van der Toorn, who I believe has been at the University of Amsterdam for a while as an administrator, but also one of the great scholars really of our time for thinking about the Hebrew Bible and its ancient Near Eastern world. He had kind of a daring theory that maybe this group had come actually from the northern part of Israel, from around Samaria, after a different exile, the one that had occurred when the Assyrians destroyed Samaria and the northern kingdom around the year 720 BCE. And they were sent out in exile. The Assyrians brought some other people in. You had mixed communities of people from all over the place. And maybe there was some kind of core group there that left, had a little bit of a sojourn, a little bit of a journey. They ended up mixing with some other peoples, some other languages, some other religions, and they ended up basically forming this community down in Egypt on this island that we call Elephantine. In Aramaic and the local parlance of the people, it might have been called something like Yev, Yod Bet in Aramaic. But this was maybe a group of exiled Jews, and we can start to use the word Jews in the post-exilic period, maybe in a more coherent way in biblical studies, whereas before that we would maybe call them Israelites when they had a nation, Israel. And in this post-exilic period, when the nation is not quite the same, we could call them maybe Jews or residents of the Persian province of Yehud or something like that. So I'll just call them Jews. These Jews maybe migrated from the northern part of the country, made their way all the way through, according to this hypothesis, and ended up down here at this island, Elephantine. Now, what did they do there that's so explosively, wildly interesting for thinking about Ezra and Nehemiah and the work that Ezra and Nehemiah did? Recall from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah that Ezra was a scribe and a teacher of the law who came from the Babylonian exile, and he came to teach the people the law. The book of Ezra actually narrates, before Ezra comes on the scene, this is in Ezra chapter 6, the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Maybe that occurred around the year 520 or 515 BCE, something like that. Around this same time, though, down at this little island of Elephantine, these Jews actually built a temple to the Lord. They call this Lord in Aramaic by the consonants YHW. So that would be something like Yaho or Yahu or something like that, which is a variant form of the word Yahweh, Yod He Vav He in Hebrew, the tetragrammaton, the divine name. So this is the same God, I think. But there's some evidence from the documents that we've recovered from this community that in fact they may have also worshipped other gods. So they might have been a polytheistic Yahweh group, if that makes sense. That's disputed though, so you got to do a deep dive into this to really start getting into that. But at any rate, they built a temple to Yahweh down there in Egypt and were apparently offering sacrifices and doing all kinds of things. Now, what's the big deal about them building a temple down there and offering sacrifices? Well, on biblical terms, the big deal is that no one is supposed to be doing that. So, okay, but what's even the big deal about that? I mean, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is a long record of God's people doing many things that they weren't supposed to be doing, right? So to find archaeological or textual evidence that they were doing things they weren't supposed to be doing, sometimes is kind of scandalous, in archaeology or whatever, but it doesn't really like destroy the Bible or prove anything massive. You could say, in a sense, it just shows what the prophets were saying was definitely true. And what people like Ezra and Nehemiah were worried about was definitely happening, namely that people were going in all kinds of directions. Okay, but there's one little fact that makes it a little bit stranger, and it is this. We actually have some of these documents from this community. It's Aramaic on papyrus. It's really beautiful papyrus. I mean, here's one of the documents that's allegedly from that community. You can just see this is not a religious document. It's a property sale document. In fact, it has a very particular date on it, September 14th, 437 BCE. They didn't use the word September or BCE, okay, but that's the kind of correlation we can make based on the Persian kings and the month that's mentioned and stuff like that. I mean, look at how beautiful that is as a papyrus. A little tattered at the top, but like that's really gorgeous. That's really gorgeous writing. Where did these papyri come from? Well, they came onto the antiquities market. They were en provenance. They weren't found in situ at the site of Elephantine, but they came to knowledge in the late 1900s, really like in 1899. And they were acquired that way, and some of them were even maybe found later. My documents fell to the floor here. Here's another document from Elephantine. A Persian inscription, the Behistun inscription of one of the Persian kings. This was a very famous inscription, so apparently they were making Aramaic copies of this and people were reading it down there. So you can see that, really beautiful. Kind of looks like the Dead Sea Scrolls. I had another document I wanted to show. I can't find it. It fell on the ground. Okay, that's totally fine. It's just what you want to see, looking for documents on there. Oh, here it is. This is one of the more famous documents that was recovered from the community. It's the so-called Passover letter, in which somebody in this community named Jedediah, who seems to have been the leader of the Elephantine community, is writing to somebody maybe named Hananiah, who is in Jerusalem, and he's maybe one of the local leaders. I can't remember if Hananiah specifically is mentioned exactly in this fragmentary letter, but he is mentioned in some of the other letters that have been recovered. Some speculate that this Hananiah is related to a similar name in the book of Nehemiah, namely as Nehemiah's brother. So Nehemiah chapter 1, The words of Nehemiah, one of my brothers, Hanani, came with certain men from Judah. So the names are kind of similar. So whether that Hananiah in the Elephantine documents is actually the Hanani who is Nehemiah's brother, not a clear thing, just kind of an idea. But at any rate, Jedediah and his group at Elephantine in Egypt is writing back and forth to some group in Jerusalem, maybe even authorities who live there, a little bit after the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, maybe around the year, 410, 412 BC is when a lot of this material is from. And they're basically asking them, like, how do we celebrate the Passover? Can we celebrate the Passover? How should that work? The letters are very fragmentary, and I'll link down below all kinds of sources where you can do a deep dive on this. So that one's maybe not super scandalous or interesting, but I'm building up to this one. That's maybe the most interesting point. There's another letter, reading here from the Context of Scripture volume, another letter that the translator here, Bezalel Porton, calls the most significant of all the Elephantine Aramaic texts, which he calls Request for Letter of Recommendation, from the year 407 BCE. Here's what happened to this temple to Yahweh, or Yao, down there at Elephantine. They had a conflict and it got burned down. Burned down by some local people. There was a scandal involving maybe some Persian authority and maybe local Egyptian priests of a different deity called Khnum or something like that. I'm not even sure how to pronounce it. Khnum, it looks like. And you can see on this map here a reconstruction of what this Yaho temple might have looked like on Elephantine with their altar there in the temple. But then you can see in this archaeological map, and indeed there was a German archaeological team that did an excavation here in the 1990s, so they've recovered part of this. You can actually see, so here's the Jewish temple, but you can see right next to it is this temenos of Khnum, or a temple or a sacred site of Khnum. Notice how close they are. Just a few feet, a few meters apart. So what the heck is this temple to the Lord by Jews doing next to this Egyptian temple, causing all kinds of conflict? What are they doing with animal sacrifices? What's the problem here? Well, the problem is that the book of Deuteronomy, and indeed the basic authoritative biblical frame, is that you can't have a temple outside of Jerusalem. You can't have a temple and you can't be offering animal sacrifices. You can't be trying to do an alternate official temple system somewhere else. Okay, so you had this group was going rogue and they were doing this kind of like wild, rogue's form of the religion down there. Maybe, but here's the weird thing. In this letter that I'm looking at here, this request for letter of recommendation, the authors, Jedediah and his group, they write this, after describing the burning down of their temple, they write this, and just bear in mind, they are writing to what seems to be official temple functionaries in Jerusalem when they write this. This comes later in the letter. If to our Lord it is good, lowercase l, they're speaking to other people here in a polite way. If to our Lord it is good, take thought of that temple to rebuild it. In other words, they're asking for support to rebuild their temple. Since they do not let us rebuild it, regard your obliges and your friends who are here in Egypt. May a letter from you be sent to them about the temple of Yaho, the god, to rebuild it in Elephantine, the fortress, just as it has been built formerly. And the meal offering and the incense and the burnt offering they will offer on the altar of Yaho, the god, in your name, and we shall pray for you at all times, we and our wives and our children and the Jews, all of them who are here. If thus they did until that temple be rebuilt, a merit it will be for you before Yaho, the God of heaven. Okay, so they're basically pleading that this temple could be rebuilt and that they would have this authorization and this permission to do it. And it seems that they received that authorization, which we can see from another letter. What's so weird about that is, like, why would any official temple structure in Jerusalem be authorizing the building of an alternate Yahweh temple in Elephantine? They shouldn't be doing that, right, by Deuteronomic law, which could cause a suspicion, and indeed some scholars have picked up on this, namely that maybe there was really no official doctrine or idea at this time in history in the 400s BCE about the temple and so on. In other words, that this is just something that was developed later and kind of made authoritative as though it had always existed and that it was always the tradition that the temple should only be in Jerusalem and nowhere else. But in fact, these Elephantine people are not at all embarrassed to ask about rebuilding this temple as though they have no clue about any such regulation. That's one interpretation, okay? Is maybe at the farthest, most scandalous end of where you could go with it. I think at the other end, though, a more moderate, modest interpretation would be, as I said before, namely that these Jews were existing in a kind of a bubble down there in their own little world. And who knows, maybe by biblical standards, they were in fact doing the wrong thing. And maybe they were corresponding with some people who didn't really care so much about the official rules and were allowing them to do this thing, okay? So I'm not sure that this has to be like explosive or scandalous or undermines the Bible at all, but I do think it actually adds color and texture, and for me, a lot of excitement and interest when thinking about the books of Ezra and Nehemiah for the following simple reason. It shows us that after the exile, when dealing with the Persian authorities and when trying to do things like rebuilding temples and interact with other people, it was a very touchy situation for Jews. In fact, I mean, just think of the Jews. They have their temple burned down in 586 BCE by the Babylonians. Then you've got a group down here trying to rebuild some other temple in Egypt, and that temple is getting burned down also by their enemies around the year 410 BCE. And of course, that second temple would be destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. So there's something of a tragic history here that I think unfolds that we can see happening to Jews in diaspora. I think the kind of color and texture that these Elephantine texts give us to understand Ezra and Nehemiah is to understand that the situation of opposition that we find in the book of Nehemiah about these people who are opposing the rebuilding of the wall and this kind of in-group fighting was a really real social dynamic that Jews had to face in this time period. And we in fact can find evidence outside the Bible from this Elephantine community that a parallel type struggle was going on in this other place. As always, there's so much to know, and I've only barely kind of danced over the surface here of the waves. But there are great depths here, and there's a lot to read and a lot to study, and I know this is a topic that I'm going to keep looking into as well. And it gets me excited about Ezra and Nehemiah to think about this rich world of conflict and intrigue and law that they were living in.